Good morning. I'm glad you have chosen to join us again this morning as we continue our lesson series on the covenant relationship. Now, if you've been following along for the last 4 weeks, then you know that we have been looking at the covenant relationship as it was originally established in the Old Testament, and then how it was described by Jesus and his disciples in what we would call the New Testament. And we have seen that in reality, it's the same covenant. There really isn't two separate covenants. They appear to be discussing the exact same things. What are those things? Well, God, the Father, is trying to draw the nations to himself, and he has decided to work through the actions of those that are in the covenant relationship with him. Now, Jesus in the New Testament calls those actions good works. He says, "Let your light shine before men, that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven." In other words, you exhibit the good works. You exhibit the actions that your Father wants you to exhibit. The world will see that, and he will be able to use those good works to draw the nations to himself. What are those good works? Well, we've been looking at those good works. Those are what we would call the law. And some of those have to do with our relationship with Yahweh, God himself, and other aspects of the good works or the law have to do with our relationship with each other. The questions that may be coming up in your mind probably stem from the fact that we see these good works or the terms of the covenant or the law in the New Testament, and yeah, we may see this being taught in some parts of the New Testament. Other parts of the New Testament, we're going to have to look more closely. But more than that, does the church even really teach the terms of the covenant like it was taught in the Old Testament? For instance, if we're still under the terms of the covenant relationship that was found in the Old Testament, what about the term of the covenant, the law that says you can't eat pork? What about that one? It's clearly written in the Old Testament, and yet Protestants, Catholics, we don't generally follow it very closely. In other words, there appears to be some laws, terms of the covenant that are, we might say, still on the books. Homosexuality, adultery, stealing. Oh yeah, we insist that people stay away from those things, and then other things we just let them slide. Is that the way it's supposed to be? Now, some people might say, well, that's because Jesus came and he did away with the law. Well, if Jesus came and he did away with the law, then what about homosexuality, adultery, and stealing? Did he not do away with those laws? And what about keeping of the feast and the festivals? Jesus actually kept those. Why don't we keep those today if they are terms of the covenant? And the Sabbath, what about the Sabbath? If the Sabbath was a term of the covenant, keeping the Sabbath holy, if that was one of the terms, why don't we keep that one? With all this confusion about what laws are we expected to follow, what laws are we not expected to follow, it's no wonder that there's tons of questions out there. And I'm reminded of a song by Bob Dylan called Mixed Up Confusion. And there's a line in that song that says, "Well, my head's full of questions, my temperature's rising fast. Well, I'm looking for some answers, but I don't know who to ask." Fortunately for us, that's not a problem. We do have someone that we can ask, and that's what we're going to do today. We are going to go and listen to a teaching by a person who can answer these questions because, quite frankly, he's the one that wrote the laws in the first place. The person I'm talking about is Yeshua, Jesus, the Word of Yahweh. And we're going to find out what he says about all of this law stuff. All right, we are continuing our lesson series on the covenant, the Old Testament covenant, and how that plays out in the New Testament. And going along with that covenant relationship, the terms of the covenant or the law. Now we came to the question, did Jesus do away with the law? Because we don't really follow all the terms of the law, of the covenant as they're found in the Old Testament. And Paul kind of hints at, well, I'm not under the law anymore. Now I'm under grace. Didn't Jesus do away with all this? Is there really any reason for us to really even look at this? But then we have these aspects of it where we in the church, we take some areas of the law very seriously, other areas we just kind of seem to ignore, and we're going to have to work out what all of this means and how all this should be playing out in the lives of followers of Yahweh. Now we just said that Jesus is going to be the one who answers this for us. We're going to go to Matthew chapter 5. So if you have your Bibles, you can open up to Matthew 5. We're going to be moving around a little bit, but for the most part, we'll be staying in Matthew 5. And what Jesus is doing in Matthew 5 is he's teaching a sermon. Now, it's of the sermons that are found in the Gospels, it's probably the most famous. It's commonly referred to as the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus is going to start teaching, and he's giving the followers of Yahweh some instructions on how to live. And these instructions we now term as the Beatitudes. Now these Beatitudes don't really seem that unusual for us, perhaps today, but for Yahweh's followers in Jesus' day, this would have been an unusual thing for Jesus to be teaching. Notice that he's saying blessed. Blessed. We've already talked about what that means. It means to have joy, have a joyful life, to have a contented life, a blessed life. You will be blessed if you are poor in spirit. So he says, blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those that mourn. Blessed are the meek. And he continues on down and he gives these different characteristics of people that are going to have that abundant life. Now, for the people in Jesus' day, Jews at the time, followers of Yahweh, this may have seemed a little bit unusual. We can almost imagine someone standing up and saying, are you doing away with the law? Are you bringing down the law? Are you teaching something different than the law? Now, why would they say that? Well, if we go to Deuteronomy chapter 30, which the people in attendance would be more familiar with this type of teaching, you can understand why people would have thought Jesus is teaching something different than the true teaching found in the law. He says, Yahweh talking here in Deuteronomy, Yahweh says, see, I have set before you today life and good, death and evil. If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I command you today, by loving the Lord your God, by walking in his ways, and by keeping his commandments, his statutes, and his rules, keep the law. If you will keep the law, is what he says, then you shall live and multiply, and the Lord your God will bless you in your life. So, in the Old Testament it says, if you want that abundant life, that contented life, the joy, the life full of joy, follow the law. Jesus comes along and he says, if you want the blessed life, the abundant life, the joyful life, do these things, have these characteristics. So it's understandable that these people would have seen this as a little bit unusual. Jesus answers the question and says, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. Now, that's Matthew 5:17. Jesus makes that statement in response to what many in the audience may have been thinking or may have even actually said. So, what can we take from that? Did Jesus do away with the law? Well, Jesus said in no uncertain terms, he did not do away with the law. I mean, folks, that's very clear. I have not come to abolish the law. I have come to fulfill them. In other words, what Jesus is saying is the law serves the same purpose today as it did in the Old Testament. He's not changing anything. The law is still the terms of the covenant. So again, we see this same thing that we've looked at over the last 4 weeks, that Jesus is teaching the Old Testament covenant. That's what he's teaching. Now, some will say, yeah, Jesus didn't say that he did away with the law. He said he fulfilled the law. And what that means is that he completed the law so that salvation is no longer, obtained by following the law. Salvation is now through faith in Jesus Christ. Well, we've already looked at, even in the Old Testament, salvation did not come from keeping the law. Remember, they entered into the covenant relationship the same way Abraham did. They placed their faith in Yahweh, and that faith, that belief that is tied to my actions, it's the same thing that Jesus taught, it's the same thing that Peter taught, that if I have a belief system that changes my actions, then I enter into the covenant relationship. So, this idea that Jesus changed it so that salvation wasn't through the law, like it was in the Old Testament, well, that's not true even in the Old Testament. We can look at Abraham and see that. Other people say, well, the way this works is the law can be grouped into 3 groupings. You have what are called the ceremonial laws. Those are like the food laws, sacrifices. Those are the ceremonial type things that the Jews did. They participated in. They acted out. You have the civil laws. This is how a community functions. So the laws regarding how to treat lepers and keeping the Sabbath, all of those types of civil laws. And then you have moral laws. The moral laws, those are the laws like you're not supposed to murder, you're not supposed to commit adultery, you're not supposed to steal. Those are actions that we have that we sometimes tie to our morality. And people who typically do this, what they'll say is, well, Jesus eliminated the first 2 groups, but he kept the 3rd one. And folks, I will be honest with you, there's nothing in the Scripture that says that. Nowhere in Scripture does Jesus ever say, I'm going to group the laws into 3 groupings, and I'm going to eliminate 2 of the groupings, and the 3rd group we're going to keep. That's just not biblical. That's something that we, as humans, have come up with to try to make sense of something that, quite honestly, is very difficult to understand. What Jesus did not mean, though, by fulfill, is to do away with them. I mean, he couldn't have meant that if we go to the very next passage. Jesus says, "For truly I say unto you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished." In other words, Jesus is saying, I'm not eliminating the iota and the dot. Those are thought to be the two smallest pen marks in the Hebrew writings. I'm not even going to do away with the very smallest things. Nothing is going to be done away until heaven and earth pass away. Well, why would all of this be undone when heaven and earth pass away? Well, when we have the new earth, there will be no nations that Yahweh will be trying to draw to himself. Everyone on the new earth will be followers. And because, remember, this is all part of the plan that Yahweh has put in place to draw the nations to himself, all of this law stuff will be pointless. There will be no laws because there will be no actions that we are supposed to exhibit to draw the nations to Yahweh. Now, that doesn't mean that we won't live moral existences in the new earth. Of course we will. But that will be Yahweh working one-on-one with the people in the new earth. That will not be a set of laws that are written down, and here are the terms of the covenant, and you are still required to follow them, because the plan will have already been completed. But Jesus very clearly says, until that happens, nothing in the law is going to change. Already covered that. So what did Jesus mean by fulfilling the law? Well, what Jesus was talking about was he was correcting the people's misunderstanding of the law. That was what he was referring to. The Beatitudes were actually the same as the law. Now we will see at the end of this lesson why that, how that is. But in reality, what Jesus was teaching, the Beatitudes, is the same thing as the law. The people misunderstood the law, therefore they didn't see it as the same thing. Jesus is trying to help the people understand the true purpose of the law. Now, fulfill. Fulfill is sort of the key in understanding this. Fulfill comes from the Greek word pleroo, which can mean different things. It could mean to make full or to fill up. It can be a rabbi phrase. And what I mean by that is rabbis in Jesus' day, and even earlier than when Jesus was alive in human form here on earth, rabbis would frequently say that they were fulfilling the law, or they were going to fulfill the law. And what that meant was to deepen a person's understanding of the law. In other words, I'm going to teach the law correctly so that you can follow it correctly. So, which one did Jesus mean? Did Jesus mean to fulfill, means I'm completing it, I'm setting it aside, you're not held accountable to it, or does he mean I'm explaining it correctly so that you can follow it correctly? Well, it can't mean the first one, so it must mean the second one. Jesus was correcting how the people understood the law, that the Beatitudes were actually the same as the law. In other words, the people had an understanding of the law that was just too narrow, and Jesus was trying to get them to understand the law from a big picture standpoint. To be honest with you, people who say that Jesus did away with the law either just don't understand what Jesus is trying to teach, or they just want to live in the covenant and not abide by the terms. Jesus did not do away with the law. This is very clear. He said, I did not come to abolish the law. At least not the original intent of the law. And that's going to be the key. The key in all of this is Jesus is keeping the law. He's keeping the original intent of the law. The problem with the people is they knew the terms of the law. They knew the terms of the covenant. They just didn't understand the intent of those terms. And Jesus was going to correct that. Now, how do we know that that's what Jesus is going to do? Well, we've already looked at Jesus' saying that I'm going to fulfill the law, meaning I'm going to explain it correctly. But if we continue on down in the chapter, we can see that Jesus does this exact thing. Jesus is now going to explain the law to the people so in a way that they can understand it. So what does Jesus say? Jesus comes along, and in Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 and 22, Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not murder. And whoever murders will be liable to the judgment. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to the judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council. And whoever says you fool will be liable to the fires of hell.'" Now, again, let's go back to what is Jesus trying to say when he says to fulfill. Notice what Jesus says here. "You have heard it said, but I tell you." In other words, this is what you have been taught, but you've been taught wrong. I am going to now explain the truth to you. This idea of murder. Now, what is the idea that the people had at the time? The original teaching was that anyone who commits murder will be liable to the judgment, the final judgment by God. In other words, only God will know if it's truly murder or not. Because murder has a heart intent. And it's really impossible for us to know if the intent in your heart was to end someone's life, if that was your true intent, or was it an accident? Were you defending your own life? Or was there some other reason that you ended up killing someone? So the idea was anyone who murders is liable to the judgment. You will be judged by God based on the intent of your heart. Jesus says that the heart is the issue. Anger is the problem. You see, in essence, what he's trying to get the people to understand is, stop worrying about murder. Anger is the real problem that people deal with. If you get anger under control, then murder is really just going to be a non-issue. The idea that the people in Jesus' day had was the law was kind of a gotcha type thing. That you could live your life however you wanted, as long as you didn't kill somebody, you didn't violate the law. But I can hate Samaritans. Oh yeah, they were fine with hating Samaritans. They were fine with being angry with Samaritans. They were fine with all of those kinds of things. But just as long as they didn't step over the line, then they were okay. And the idea was the law is just a line. I cannot cross that line, but I can get as close to it as I want. Jesus comes along and he says, wait a minute, that's not what the purpose of the law is. The purpose of the law is not to just show you where the line is. The purpose of the law is to be a warning sign for you. You can almost hear Jesus talking about Genesis 4. So if you know the story in Genesis 4, Adam and Eve, the man and the woman, they have two children. They have Cain and Abel. Cain brought an offering to Yahweh, and Yahweh was not pleased with the offering. Abel brought an offering to Yahweh. Yahweh was pleased with the offering. And and Cain gets very angry about this. So here we have in Genesis, starting with verse 1, Genesis 4 starting in verse 1, that entire story as played out. Cain being angry, the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at the door. It desires you to have you, but you must rule over it." In other words, what God, Yahweh, was saying to Cain is, your anger is not sin, but because that anger is there, sin is waiting. It's crouching at the door, waiting to strike. Murder, that would be the sin. It's waiting to strike. If you don't get control of this and you allow this anger to progress, then sin is what the end result will be. Again, we're going to be focusing on this statement. Sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is to have you, but you must rule over it. This is in essence what Jesus is talking about with this idea of murder. He's saying the law serves as a warning sign. It's not just a line in the sand. If you cross the line, you've committed sin. That's true. It is a line in the sand. You cross the line, you've committed sin. But the law serves as a warning to us that when we allow our anger to continue building and building and building, we're getting closer and closer to that line. And the law is this flashing warning saying, get back. You've got to get back away from the line. You're approaching a point, a place in your life where you are about to cross the line that would lead to sin. And it's not just I can live however I want as long as I don't cross the line. The law serves as a warning to us. You're angry. You've got to get this under control, because if you don't, the end result will be sin. And Jesus is saying that anger is that intent that God is going to judge. That is the intent that we talk about when we talk about what's the difference between murder and it was an accident. I accidentally did something to harm another person. It's talking about anger. And God speaks to us in our conscience. If we don't get that anger under control, the law, God speaking through His law, is a flashing light saying, you've got to get this under control. Because remember, it damages our witness to the world. If we violate the law, the world sees that, and that damages our witness to the world. Our actions are no longer those actions that Yahweh can use to draw the nations to Himself. So the law is telling us, stay away. You're heading in a bad place, and you need to get back into the straight and narrow line where God wants you to be. You must get control of this, and the issue, therefore, is anger. So if we allow all of this to continue, we start with anger. This is what Jesus said. It all begins with anger. The law is a flashing sign warning you've got to get this anger under control. Then Jesus says, but if you don't, if you progress, allow anger to progress so that it leads to slandering someone, well, now it's going to get even worse. You may have to face a physical judgment, and that is who he's talking about when he says the council. So if you slander the person you're angry with, now you may have a physical judgment to worry about. If you don't get it under control at that point, and you go to the level of saying, thou fool, he says, well, then you could at that point be in danger of the fires of hell. Now, what does it mean to say, you fool or thou fool? Well, what it's not is, it's not a warning against using the word. In other words, if two friends see each other on the street and one of them says, "Hey fool, what are you doing?" And I know I don't do that well, but that's not what God is saying, because remember, it's grounded in anger. The issue, Jesus says, is all about anger, and we allow the anger to progress. So just calling someone a fool out of friendship, that's not that big of a deal. The meaning of the fool in Jesus' day is tied to the scriptures, is tied to the Old Testament. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. When someone in Jesus' day called someone a fool, what you're saying is, you're a blasphemer, you're a heretic. If you allow your anger to continue so that it reaches the level of slander, now you may have a physical judgment with the council that you have to deal with. If you, though, don't get it under control and you allow it to progress to the point that you are falsely declaring someone to be a blasphemer or a heretic just so that the law, the legal system, can injure them, can punish them, now he says, now you're in danger of the fires of hell. He's giving a progression here. This is not all the same thing. He's saying that you don't get your anger under control. It progresses to the point of being very serious. But it all starts right here, and that is something we have to, in essence, control so that it doesn't progress any farther. In other words, the original purpose of that law, yes, it is a line in the sand. Do not commit murder. That is a line in the sand. Don't cross over that line. But it's also a warning to us. When we are angry, the law, you shall not kill, you shall not commit murder, is screaming, sin is crouching at the door and you must overcome it. That is in essence what the commandment is saying. And this gives us a chance to judge our own hearts and know where do we stand in relation to Yahweh that we're in the covenant with. How do we stand with Him and the law in our hearts? And the law gives us an opportunity to judge our hearts before we ever cross over the line. We go to the next one. Jesus continues on and he says, Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 and 28, "You have heard that it said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Notice, here we have it again. You have heard it said, this is what you were taught, but I am going to teach you the correct meaning of this law. The correct meaning of the law is it's a flashing sign. It's telling us that our hearts are veering into sinful territory. Again, it's not that I can just live my life any way that I want as long as I don't cross that line, as long as I don't commit adultery, I'm okay. I mean, yeah, as long as you don't commit adultery, you're not committing sin. That may be true. But the law is more than just a line in the sand. When I start lusting after another person, the law is a flashing sign saying, wake up. Your intent is wrong. Sin is crouching at the door, and you've got to get control of it. You've got to get control of this lust that you are dealing with. If you do allow this to continue, you will cross the line and commit adultery. If we stop lusting, if we get control of the intent of our heart, we'll never cross the line. And so what is Jesus saying? Jesus is giving you a warning. When you look lustfully at a person that you desire sexually, he says, you've already committing adultery in your heart. The law is warning you, your heart is wrong. Get it under control so that you don't continue progressing forward. Now, we know that adultery is sin. We know that murder is sin. So for those of you that are preparing for standardized tests, here is my professor teaching for you. Lust is to adultery as anger is to murder, is in essence what Jesus is saying. Both of those have the same meaning. Lust is the problem. Left under control, it will eventually lead to adultery. Anger is the problem. Left under control, it will eventually lead to murder. And the laws, those two laws, are screaming, get these two under control so that these two never become an issue. Now some people say, well, what Jesus is saying is lust and anger are now sins. Jesus has expanded what sin is. But folks, if that is true, then we've got some other issues with other passages. Paul says in Ephesians chapter 4, be angry and do not sin. Be angry and sin not. In other words, Paul is making it very clear, I can be angry and not commit sin. James says in James chapter 1, but each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire or your lust. This is what Satan uses to tempt us. He uses our lust to tempt us. Is that sin? No. Then desire, that lust, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin. In other words, just what Jesus was saying in Matthew 5, that when the lust is not brought under control, it will lead to sin. So we can't say that Jesus is expanding this and he's saying, okay, not only are murder and adultery sins, but Jesus is saying being angry and lusting are sins now. That's not what Jesus is saying, because if that is, then these two verses are wrong. Remember, folks, we have to study Scripture in its totality, in its entirety. We can't just pick things independently and say, well, that's what Jesus is saying. We have to look at things from the totality of the Scriptures. And the totality of the Scriptures say lust and anger are not sins. But you let them go uncontrolled, they will lead to sin. And the law is telling us that. We can continue on here in Matthew chapter 5, verses 31 and 32. Jesus continues. He says, it was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Here we have it again. It was said, but I say to you. Jesus is saying, I know you've been taught, but you have an incorrect understanding. I am going to now teach you what the law really means. Now, to really understand what this law means, we're going to have to go back into the Old Testament. Remember, Jesus he's a Jew. He understands life based on the Old Testament, based on the Hebrew Scriptures, the law. So let's look at what Jesus is teaching when he is getting into this idea of marriage and divorce. In Deuteronomy chapter 24, beginning in verse 1, it says, when a man takes a wife and marries her, if then she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, and she departs out of his house. And as she goes and becomes another man's wife, and the latter man hates her and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter man dies who took her to be his wife, then her former husband who sent her away may not take her again to be his wife. What does all of this mean? This is where we get this idea of a certificate of divorce. And what the people in Jesus' day understood of the certificate of divorce was incorrect. We can see that in Matthew chapter 19, beginning in verse 3. And the Pharisees came to Jesus, and tested him by asking him, "Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause?" He answers, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother, and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, not let man separate." They said to him, "Why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and to send her away?" He said, "Because of the hardness of your heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery." Again, we have this seeming contradiction between what is taught in the Old Testament and what is taught in the New Testament. And that is because there was a misunderstanding of the certificate of divorce. The certificate of the divorce was not for the man. Look, you've got to keep in mind, the idea is he wanted to divorce his wife because he found some reason that he didn't like. In fact, in the Jewish tradition at the time of Jesus, a man could divorce his wife because she burned the meal that they were eating. Okay, that's the indecency. I'm tired of you. Leave. Jesus said, Yahweh gave that option, a certificate of divorce, because of the hardness of your heart. Not because the man needed a certificate of divorce so that he could marry again. You'd say the man finds a younger woman, he wants to be with this newer model, and so he finds some reason, okay, she burned the food, she tore my favorite shirt or whatever, I can now give her a certificate of divorce and get rid of her. That was kind of the view of the people, the Jewish people in Jesus' day. Again, as long as you had a real reason. Didn't matter how close you got to that line, if you had a real reason for and gave her the certificate of divorce, it was fine to divorce her. And Jesus says, no, that was not the purpose of the certificate of divorce. A man in those days, in the Old Testament when that was written in Deuteronomy, a man didn't need a certificate of divorce to marry someone else. Men in that day could have multiple wives if they wanted to. It wasn't some horrible thing. David had multiple wives. Solomon had multiple wives. Even Abraham, to a very large degree, had multiple wives, because the writing, the way it's written in the book of Genesis, makes it sound like that when Sarah gave Abraham her handmaiden, the terminology there is the handmaiden became his wife. So Abraham had multiple wives. Elkanah, who was the father of Samuel, had multiple wives. Gideon had multiple wives. There are all kinds of men in the Old Testament that had multiple wives. There was no reason that a man had to have a certificate of divorce to marry a newer model. No, the certificate was for the woman, because he's going to do it anyway. Because of the hardness of his heart, he's going to marry this other woman anyway. And so what Yahweh said was, you give her a certificate of divorce so that she can go out and marry somebody else. Otherwise, she is going to have to stay in this marriage while her husband is going out and finding other wives. Now, if she wants to stay in the marriage, that's fine, she can. But the idea being, if she wants out of the marriage, she ought to be able to get out of the marriage if this man goes and gets another wife. That is in essence what Yahweh is saying. So, if you find this indecency in this woman and you want to get rid of her so that you can marry somebody else, well, fine. But you got to give her a certificate of divorce so that she can live her life as well. But I do want you to know there's a limit to what this man can do. Yahweh says that if the latter man dies, in other words, the woman's second husband were to die, the former husband who sent her away cannot have her again to be his wife. You don't get to just send her away because you want a younger wife, and then when you find out that as a 60-year-old man you don't really have much in common with a 20-year-old woman, and this 20-year-old woman doesn't cook as well, and she doesn't clean the house like you want her to, and all of these things that you actually did like about your first wife, you don't get to just bring the first wife back into the family. It doesn't work that way. In other words, he's warning against, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Every marriage, every relationship does have things that people like and things that people don't like. And if you get to focusing on the things that you don't like to the point that you get rid of the first wife, you just need to understand you're going to lose the things that you liked as well. And you don't get to have them back. This is what Yahweh is saying. It's kind of like that song by Cinderella, who, not the greatest rock band of all time, that would be Kiss. Kiss is the greatest rock band of all time. But Cinderella is my favorite rock band. And in their album, Long Cold Winter, they have a song entitled, Don't Know What You Got Till It's Gone. If you have never heard it, you can go listen to it if you want. But it's kind of like that. All too often, we don't know what we have until we lose it or until we get rid of it. That is sort of what Yahweh is saying about this certificate of divorce. So what is the meaning of the law that Jesus is talking about? If we go back to Matthew, where he is saying, you were taught this, but I'm going to explain to you what this means. He's saying that the law is a warning sign. It's a flashing sign saying your heart is not where it should be. You're wanting this certificate of divorce unless, and Jesus clarifies, unless there is sexual immorality. But if there's no sexual immorality, you're wanting this divorce for wrong reasons. Yahweh didn't give the law so that the man could just get rid of his wife. He gave the law so that the woman could have a good life too, and as a warning sign, hey, you don't have love in your heart the way that you should, and you need to get control of this, because I promise you that if you continue down this path of getting rid of this woman because, you know, she burned the food, there's going to come a day when you are not going to be happy with the new wife, and you're going to want the first wife back, and no, you don't get the first wife back. You see, this is what the law is trying to teach, and Jesus is trying to get the people to understand that that is the true meaning of the law. The law is shouting out that your heart is wrong. It's pushing this man, my evil heart is pushing me, the man, to treat this woman badly. Sin is crouching at the door, but you must rule over it. That's the purpose of the law. Not just so that some guy can get him a new wife. That was never the purpose of the law. Then we continue on. We go to the next statement in Matthew chapter 5, beginning in verse 33 through 37. Again, you have heard it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. But I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let what you say simply be yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil. All right, so what does Jesus say? Jesus is taking, first off, let me remind you, here it is. You have heard that it was said, but I say to you. Yes, I know that's what you were taught, but your understanding is wrong. So let me explain it to you. Jesus is talking about something that we've discussed already before. This idea that we are not to bring God's name into our evil dealings as a way of convincing someone that I will do what I agree to do, even though I don't really intend on fulfilling my part of the bargain. Jesus is saying, this is all a flashing warning to you. If you have to bring Yahweh's name into these oaths that you take, it's because you have a bad reputation in the community. The community doesn't trust your word. You can't be trusted just on your word alone. So you must bring Yahweh's name into the oath just to be sure that you will fulfill your part. And Jesus then says, just let your yes mean yes and your no mean no. Get a reputation that you are a man of your word and leave Yahweh out of all of this. Just live the life that you're supposed to live. This law, this idea is screaming to you that you are not living right. You can't be trusted by those in your community. That needs to be addressed. We continue on. Matthew chapter 5, verse 38 and 40. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. So once again, here we have it. You have heard that it was said, but I say to you. What is Jesus saying? You were taught an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but your understanding of it is wrong. Their idea of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, was Yahweh giving them permission to get vengeance. You do something to me, I'm going to get back at you. And Jesus is saying, no, I'm telling you that you misunderstand that law, that aspect of the covenant. The law is saying something else. So what is the law then saying? Well, in order to understand this, we have to understand who is at fault. Now, the scenario is a person slaps us, a person sues us. Who's at fault? Why is this person doing these things to us? Why is this person slapping us? Why is this person suing us? Well, to get a better idea of what's going on, if we go back earlier in the chapter, we're going to see that every one of these examples that Jesus is using has the same person at fault. So let's look at this. If you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. come to terms quickly with your accuser while you're going with him to court, lest your accuser hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you be put in prison. Truly I say to you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny. So, the question on this is, who's at fault? Now, all too often, I hear this taught that if you're angry at your brother, then God will not accept your offering. When you come to Him and ask for forgiveness and give your offering to Him, He won't accept it until you go and make peace with your brother. Well, what if my brother is the one that did the wrong thing? Doesn't matter. You're angry, therefore you're the one that has to go make peace. And that is not what Jesus says here. Notice Jesus says, if you are offering your gift, so you're going to the Father with your prayers, with your gifts, with your offering, and your brother has something against you, there's no indication you're mad at your brother. The indication is your brother's mad at you. Why? Because you did something to him. In that case, leave your gift and be reconciled with your brother. You see, Jesus is not teaching that as believers, it's our responsibility to fix every problem that everyone has, even if the other person is at fault. I'm not saying that we can't do that. I'm not saying that as a peacemaker we can't try to live at peace. Paul talks about as much as is within you, live at peace with all people. I mean, yeah, we do try to live at peace. But as long as I'm trying to live at peace, the Father is okay with those efforts. Well, what if my brother has done something to me and we haven't made peace? Well, that's not your fault. That's your brother's fault. You do as much as is within you to live at peace with all people. But if you're at fault, then you do have to go make peace. And it's not one of these things, well, you know, if I've ever done anything to you, I can't think of anything that I have ever done to you, but if I've ever done anything to you, I'm really sorry. That's not what Jesus is saying either. Jesus is saying, go to them and say, I did this and I'm sorry. I'm here to try to make peace. You see, this is what Jesus is trying to get His followers to understand. This is what you're supposed to do. And if you do that, you can restore these relationships. But I do want you to understand who's at fault. In every one of these situations in this chapter, the anger, murder, who's at fault? You are. You're the one angry. And if you don't get it under control, you're the one that's going to commit murder. Lust and adultery, who's at fault? You are. You're the one lusting, and if you don't get it under control, you're going to commit adultery. Certificate of divorce, who's at fault? You are. You're the one that's going to give your wife a certificate of divorce because you found some reason to get rid of her. And the law is saying you are at fault. You need to love your wife. You need to love this person and not treat her this way. The oath to Yahweh. Who's at fault? You are, because you don't live a life that makes people confident that you're a person of your word. You're at fault, you're at fault, you're at fault. So who is at fault in this last one on the eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth? You are. That's what Jesus is saying. He's saying, you're at fault, therefore you're being slapped and you're being sued. Now, at the same time, the purpose for an eye and a tooth for a tooth is not so that, hey, I do something to a person, They get angry and slap me. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. I get to slap them back. No. Or I do something bad to a person, they get angry and they sue me. Oh, then I can get back at them. No. That's not what the law is saying. What the law is saying is the eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. It's saying, wake up. You just got slapped because your actions are wrong. You just got sued because your actions are wrong. The law is designed to be a flashing sign. Hey, wake up. You are acting inappropriately. The law was never designed for me to just be able to get vengeance. The law was always designed for me in the wrong. Someone else brings the government against me. I get sued. Jesus said, well, you're the one that's in the wrong. So if they want this, give them that and more, because you're the one that caused the problem. If you're the one that was in the wrong, if you get slapped, well, let them slap you and give them your other cheek too, because you're the one that caused the problem to begin with. The eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth was designed to wake me up. It was not designed so that I could just get vengeance. Conclusions. What can we take from all this? First off, Jesus is not doing away with the law. Jesus understands that the people didn't have a good understanding of what the law was saying, and he was trying to clear this up. That the law is not just a line in the sand, and I can get as close to those lines as I want to. I can do whatever I want as long as I don't cross those lines. The law, the purpose of the law, the intent of the law is to wake me up to problems in my own heart. You have a heart problem long before you commit murder. You have a heart problem long before you commit adultery. You have a heart problem long before you get to the point of giving a certificate of divorce to your wife. You have a heart problem long before people don't trust you in business dealings. All of this is, you have a heart problem, and the law is shining a light on our hearts, telling us sin is crouching at the door, and you got to get this under control. You got to get this taken care of. You have to fix this. The purpose is to help us remain holy, is to help our community to remain a holy community of believers. Remember, holy meaning separated. We're different than the world. The law points out all the times that we start straying and getting out into areas that the world exists in. And the law warns us, hey, get back into the terms of the covenant. So, then how does all this play with the connection with the Beatitudes? Well, Jesus says, blessed are the peacemakers. Folks, this is just a generic idea that encapsulates a lot of the law. If you look at the law as a whole, that's what the law is telling us. Not every aspect of the law, but a large part of the law is telling us we're to keep peace. We're to be peacemakers. We're to try to repair relationships that we have damaged. Now, look, again, if someone else damages the relationship, there's a limit to what you can do. But if you damage the relationship, your job is to repair relationships. Your job is to do what you can, as Paul said, as much as is within you, live at peace with all people. That's what the law is saying. Jesus is trying to teach the people a more wide view of the law instead of every little individual term of the covenant. He's taking a step back and he's saying, this is what the law is saying. We are to be peacemakers. We're to be merciful. We're to hunger and desire righteousness. That's what the law is that way. So do you mean, okay, so once we're in the covenant, the law is a guide to help us stay on the straight path, out of sin. It's so that the world can see our good works. As we start straying out into sin, our good works go away, and God's plan to work with those good works to draw the nations to himself fails. Our job is to keep in the area of the good works so that Yahweh's plan works the way it was supposed to be. The law was never designed to make humanity righteous. It was never what tied us to the covenant. That's really the key. Did David lose his position in the covenant because he committed adultery and committed murder? No. The law never was a way for us to be righteous, and the law never was what tied anyone to the covenant. The only thing that the law can do is to show fault. That's all it's capable of doing. I mean, it shows us our hearts as we are straying from where we should be. It shows us when we cross the line. Yes, it does that, and it does it perfectly. Now, someone may be saying, okay, well that's all well and good, but in the ancient world, breaking the terms of the covenant meant the covenant was broken. So, you have been comparing this covenant that we're in to the covenant in the ancient world, and in the ancient world, you break a term of the covenant is broken, and the suzerain king, go back and watch the other videos for that explanation. The suzerain king, the higher king, can bring down the hammer. That is the beauty of this. Yahweh found a brilliant way to separate the covenant from the terms of the covenant. In other words, I can be in the covenant and not keep the terms of the covenant. Really? Yes. It's beautiful what Yahweh did. Then how do I obtain righteousness? I mean, if it's not from keeping the law, if you say, well, I could be in the covenant without keeping all the terms, then how do I obtain righteousness the same way they did in the Old Testament? Abraham believed God and was counted to him for righteousness. Now remember, that belief is a life-changing belief. It's not just, well, I believe that God exists. It is, I believe to the point that I am going to change my life to match up with that belief. You enter into the covenant through grace. Okay, so God gives me the opportunity to enter into the covenant just because He's graceful. Simply because He grants me the opportunity. I don't deserve it. Prior to entering into the covenant, and even since entering into the covenant, but prior to entering into the covenant, I lived a sinful life. I don't deserve to get to enter into the covenant, but He gives me the opportunity to enter into the covenant anyway. That's grace. He gives me that chance even though I don't deserve it. The law does not get me into the covenant. Only grace can do that. There's no way I can keep enough of the law that God would say, oh, wow, you're worthy of the covenant. Yahweh looks at every one of us and says, you're not worthy of the covenant. You're not worthy of me. But I am going to extend the opportunity anyway, even though you don't deserve it. The law doesn't get me into the covenant. Only grace can do that. So if we go back to the questions that we talked about at the introduction, if Jesus didn't start a new religion, then what do we do with the Old Testament laws that say you can't eat pork? Well, again, the law that says you can't eat pork has really nothing to do with us eating pork. The law that says you can't eat pork is God's way of saying you need to live a life that's separate from the world. So in the Old Testament, he said the way you're going to do this is you're going to have certain food laws. The world will actually see physical evidence that you live a different way. Well, it's the same for us today. We have an obligation to live a life that shows the world that we live differently. Again, this law right here is screaming out to us, you need to live a separated life. Now, if you want to not eat pork and let the world know, I don't eat pork because I'm in a relationship with Yahweh, that's great. But if you want to come up with another way of letting the world know I'm in a relationship with Yahweh, that's great too. This law should be screaming to each one of us, you've got to live a separated life. Why are some laws still in the books and others are completely ignored? Well, to be honest with you, that one I don't know. I can't answer why some people say that some laws are still in effect and others aren't. Every law is still in effect in terms of what the law should be screaming to us. Homosexuality, the laws against homosexuality should be screaming to us that if you or if anyone has homosexual feelings, you need to get that under control. It's no different than inappropriate heterosexual feelings. All inappropriate sexual feelings need to be brought under control. Now, what if I fail? What if a married man and a married woman have a sexual relationship? Are they kicked out of the covenant? No, because remember, the covenant has been separated from the terms. What about this? What if a homosexual man has a sexual relationship with another homosexual man? Well, it's the same. You don't get kicked out of the covenant because the terms of the covenant and the covenant have been separated. God came up with a brilliant way to do that. The same thing with adultery, same thing with stealing. All of it is the same. All sin is breaking of the terms of the covenant. And every one of these laws is screaming at us, you need to get your heart right. But it doesn't matter if we're talking about homosexuality or we're talking about eating pork. The law itself has a purpose, and it should be screaming at us, your heart isn't right if you are not living according to the terms of the covenant. But it doesn't mean you're kicked out of the covenant. Did Jesus change the laws as it pertains to feasts and festivals? No. Again, the feasts and festivals were designed to remind us that we are in this covenant relationship with Yahweh, and it gives us in the Old Testament, it gave them an opportunity to remember the wonderful things that Yahweh does, that He takes care of us, He provides for us. And so there were these feasts and festivals that they celebrated to remind them of this. It's the same thing as Thanksgiving should be doing for us today. If I don't want to keep the feasts and festivals like they did in the Jewish tradition, that's okay. But I do need to have things in my life that serve as a reminder of how wonderful Yahweh is to me. Did Jesus change the laws that pertains to Sabbath? No. Remember, Sabbath is a weekly reminder that I am an imager of Yahweh. If I don't want to have my weekly reminder on Saturday, and I want to have it on Sunday, well, that's fine. If I don't want to have my weekly reminder on Saturday or Sunday because I have to work on the weekend, oh, that's fine. Have it on Monday. Have it on Tuesday. But you do need to have one day every week where you just stop working and just spend the day being reminded of who you are in the covenant relationship. So, if you don't ever have any day, it's not like, if you never take a day off, it's not like you get kicked out of the covenant, but the law is screaming to you, hey, you need to take a day every week. How do we address this statement that Paul made in Romans chapter 4? For sin will have no dominion over you, so since you are not under the law but under grace. Well, that's exactly what we've been talking about. I'm under the umbrella of grace. The law does serve as a warning to me. It shows me the lines in the sand that I'm not allowed to cross, but I am under the umbrella of grace. If I break one of those, well, that's not what break one of those laws, cross the line. Well, that's not the purpose of the law. The purpose of the law was never to say, oh, you broke the law, you're out of the covenant. No, the covenant is because of grace. But yes, I am under grace. The law is not what determines whether or not I stay in the covenant or not. So then someone may ask, well, even if you don't keep all the terms of the covenant, you still get to stay in the covenant even if you don't keep all the terms? Yes. Even if you don't keep all the terms. What if you break a law every day? What if every single day I break a law, one of the terms of the covenant? And do I still get to stay in the covenant then? Yes. Are you saying then that it's impossible for me to lose my righteousness? Well, that is a great question. And that is what we're going to talk about next week, is as we finish out our study of the law. So next week we will finish out this study, and we're going to be going to Galatians chapter 3. Paul does an amazing job of explaining all of this. Y'all have a good week. I appreciate you coming and studying what Jesus said about the law so that we have a better understanding of it. And I look forward to seeing you next week. Bye-bye.